From the Oklahoma newsroom, it's time for Thunder Thursday. I'm Jenny Carlson here with Thunder beat writers Eric Horn, Brett Dawson. Nothing's been going on, guys. What are we even going to talk about today?
Pretty slow week.
Kind of quiet.
All's quiet on the Western Front.
Well, now it may be, but it was not this past weekend, guys. Obviously, free agency kicking into gear, and everything seemingly happens at once. Paul George decides to stay in Oklahoma City. We get news not long after. Nerlens Noel will be joining. Raymond Felton re-signs with the Thunder, on and on and on. But obviously the big news is Paul George. Eric, what was the most surprising part of all that for you?
Probably the length of the contract he signed. I think that the consensus would have been that he'd go short-term if he did come back to Oklahoma City. But, you know, signing a 4-year deal, that aligns he and Russell Westbrook for the next 4 years at least, or at least the next 3 years, because he has a player option in the last year of his deal, Paul George does. But it's big for the Thunder, obviously. I mean, this is what they worked an entire year for. This was the gamble that they made in hopes that Paul George would re-sign. But that he'd re-sign for 4 years, I think that's got to be beyond any Thunder fans' wildest expectations.
Yeah, obviously some amazement, I think, would be a proper word by some folks. Brian Windhorst, namely, on the ESPN broadcast, practically lost his mind almost on air. Brett, what was the most surprising part of all this for you?
The most surprising part was definitely the 4 years, by far and away. The most disappointing part, Paul George was not on the private jet that Eric and I had staked out at the airport. So that was by far the biggest disappointment. We wanted visual confirmation that Paul George was in town for this big party that everybody knew was happening, but we weren't 100% sure if Paul George was going to be at. He wasn't on the plane. He did get here. We don't know how he got here.
Guys, the thing that stands out to me, in addition to the 4 years, I agree with what you're saying, but the fact that he didn't even really talk to the Lakers, a team that a year ago was his stated destination, that he didn't even, as far, I mean, at least under league rules. I mean, to think that there was no contact, I mean, I think we'd all be naive to say there was no contact, but to not take an actual meeting with the Lakers, that was a little bit surprising to me.
That was a big surprise, actually. It is the Lakers, and the pessimist would say the Lakers already got fined $500,000 for tampering with Paul George, so who's to say they didn't have some kind of conversation. But I think what we saw in the three-part series that he did on ESPN, particularly the last part, which we didn't get to see until notably after he had made the decision, you saw Billy Donovan come to the house and ask about the kids and, you know, is your daughter walking yet and all this sort of stuff. You saw Sam Presti being able to lay out this vision for Paul George. They had this whole year, and Paul said in that series, you know, I think people think of it that every day was a recruitment, and it wasn't. But it was about building relationships with Sam Presti, with Billy Donovan, and I think as we saw over the course of the year, and certainly had laid out for us in the last episode of that series, with Russell Westbrook.
You know, guys, the last time the Thunder obviously had a situation like this was Durant 2 years ago. And the way that they did the recruitment then, they'd obviously had a much longer time to recruit and develop those relationships with Durant. But do you think that some of the ways that they went about this, was that changed, Eric, based on the result of the Durant decision 2 years ago?
I think it had to have been. I think that any smart franchise would learn from, you know, what they went through with a previous free agency that essentially failed because Durant left. You know, being able to recruit these guys that are these top-tier max-level free agents, it takes a little bit something different. And the Thunder knew that they weren't going to be able to get a guy in here to take a trip or a recruiting visit. And basically, Paul George's agent, Aaron Mintz, said that probably wasn't going to happen if the Thunder didn't make that bold trade. So once they made that bold trade, from day one, you've got Russell Westbrook there to meet him for dinner. You've got a massive party at downtown to introduce Paul George to the world. You've got this party planned for his introduction back to the Oklahoma City community when he does sign. It's a continual process of the Thunder. While Paul said it wasn't a day-to-day recruitment, it was from the Thunder's perspective, I think. I think that they had to continue to show this guy that he was appreciated, that they wanted to build with him, and they wanted him to be a part of something special. And I think that went along to Russell Westbrook as well. You know, he talked throughout the season. It's more about the relationships off the court to him that matter more than the actual on-court stuff. I don't know if he thought that the entire time he was with Kevin Durant for 8 years.
You know, obviously, Westbrook and that relationship, we knew that that was going to be central. Is Paul George going to want to sign up, going to want to hitch his wagon to Russell Westbrook's wagon. He makes the decision to do that, but obviously there was a third wheel we thought a year ago in Carmelo Anthony. Now he's largely absent from all of this. I don't mean he's not been really talked about, mentioned. Brett, I think there's some suspicion that Carmelo's probably, there's got to be something that changes between what we saw at the end of last year and going into next year. But where does all this lead us down the path as it relates to Carmelo?
Well, the obvious option is that he's not here at all, and the really obvious reason for that is the Thunder could stretch the remaining $27.9 million, the last year of his contract, over 3 years. You stretch that cap hit, there's some downside to that because you've got dead money sitting on your cap for the next 3 seasons, including this one. There's a real upside in that it could save you about $100 million in a tax payment right now. So, there are a lot of things to manage and work through with Carmelo. First, they may want to explore some trades with some other high-value contracts. They may be trying to decide whether they want to stretch that. They may still be engaged in conversation with Carmelo Anthony about a role and whether he wants to be back here and thinking about the other things they could do to give themselves a break on that tax bill, and they will get a break on it somewhere. I still think the Carmelo Anthony thing, they have to decide by August 31st if they're going to stretch it. But I still think it's a conversation at this point. I don't think it's a decision quite yet.
As much as the way he was used or would be used, I think is on the mind of a lot of people at this point after the way the playoffs ended. What you just said, Brett, really springs to my mind. $100 million potentially. Sorry, I can't even think in those terms, much less speak in them. $100 million that could be saved if they stretch Carmelo. Maybe that doesn't supersede the on-court stuff, Eric, but that has to be more of a thought for the Thunder now than it was before they knew for sure about Paul George.
Yeah, it has to be because it's just so much money and it's astronomical and it's unprecedented. No team has ever paid that much for one player, let alone an entire team, or for one team, let alone an entire player. Mm-hmm. So it's something that the Thunder's obviously thinking about. The value of Carmelo on the roster relative to the value of just stretching him out, how much do you lose there? Look, as much as people don't want to face facts, Carmelo Anthony is still a really good scoring player in this league. He can still get points. That's 16 or 17 more points that you'd have to find elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So it's a decision the Thunder's going to have to make that seems easy on the surface, but it's not so easy when you're talking about continuing to field a competitive team. I tend to think that the Thunder wouldn't lose a ton by stretching Carmelo Anthony, but at the same time, as Brett said, that'd be dead money on your salary cap. You're going to be in the tax regardless of whether you have Carmelo Anthony here this year or here next year or this year. You're still going to be in the tax. Yeah. So it's a matter of what the Thunder thinks the value is in trying to bring him back and potentially making him into the kind of player that they wanted to be, that catch-and-shoot three-point specialist.
Obviously part of the equation, as I was listing off all the free agent moves at the start, I didn't mention Jerami Grant, which we thought might end up being their biggest free agent signing if Paul George walked. He signs on immediately almost after Paul George does, Brett, and I think a lot of people, the way that he's continued to evolve, Grant has, see him as the possible step in, fill in, obviously different, but still filling that spot that Carmelo had. How does all of that interact, if at all?
Well, I don't see him right now as a guy who would step in and start if Carmelo Anthony's not here. And the main reason for that is not because of the things that Jerami Grant does. It's really the thing he doesn't do. He's not a real high-level shooter. And you don't always have to have a real high-level shooter at power forward. The problem is when you're playing Russell Westbrook, theoretically and hopefully for the Thunder, Andre Robertson and Steven Adams in a lineup together, if your four-man doesn't make three-point shots, you're sort of leaving Paul George out there as the only guy who's a high-level three-point shooter, and you could use a little more spacing of the floor than that. We've seen what happens when there aren't guys to spread the floor around Westbrook. It can get a little crowded. So I think Patrick Patterson, for example, is a more likely starter, but Grant is going to play a huge role. He's going to play more minutes. Whether or not he starts, he needs to play more, and Carmelo needs to play less, whether that means so much less that he's not here or just less and conceding some stuff to Grant. And
not just Carmelo's three-point shooting or the potential for him to hit three-point shots, but it's just another shot creator.
Yeah.
You want somebody on the floor at that power forward position or at least at any other position around Russell Westbrook and Paul George that can create another shot so that it's not just those two guys having to shoot the ball in every possession. Steven Adams and Andre Robertson require other people to create shots for them. That was kind of the dream of having a Carmelo Anthony on this team. You get another shot creator, and it's supposed to be especially fruitful in the playoffs.
Yeah.
Now, Carmelo wants to play a little bit more similar to the style that he played previously in his career. Can the Thunder find a balance in between that? Can they find a middle ground to where they get the catch-and-shoot three-pointers they want from him, and they get some of the creativity that Carmelo likes to implement into his game? Problem is, what Carmelo Anthony wants to implement more into his game is just not efficient for today's NBA. The multiple jab steps, the isolation, holding the ball in the post, the long two-pointers, that's just not conducive to good offense in today's NBA. And I think another misconception about Carmelo in general is that people see the stretch provision or the options that come with Carmelo and the constant talk about it as if he was a detriment to the team in terms of the locker room. That's not the issue with Carmelo Anthony.
Yeah.
He was perfectly fine in the locker room. He's a great teammate to those guys. Russell Westbrook and Paul George enjoyed having him around. It's just weighing how much you're paying for one guy for 1 year against what he's going to bring to the team and how he can contribute.
And let's remember, too, guys, there are tons of metrics you can look at, but when that starting five, which included Carmelo Anthony, was whole at the beginning of the year before Andre Robertson's injury, that was an extremely offensive, efficient machine. I mean, they did a lot with that offensive lineup and were pretty good overall with that starting five. I guess that begs the question, do we know for sure what Andre Robertson's going to be coming back? Is that has to be part of the equation, too.
And we don't know that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. We don't know how close he's going to be to 100%. We don't know, everything they've said, they've targeted, start of the season. We'll see if that happens, and we'll see what he is when he gets there. But yeah, those five guys starting together over the course of the time they started together, from the beginning of the season to January, they were plus 14.2 points per 100 possessions. That's a great number. It's better than the Warriors starting five. And that's with really Paul George and Russell Westbrook and Carmelo Anthony having down shooting years for a long part of that stretch. Paul George rallied before Andre Robertson went out. Carmelo stayed down. His numbers never really, from a shooting standpoint, got to the place you expect him to get. So that unit was good defensively. Robertson masked a lot of the things that some of the other guys didn't do. They played really well offensively despite not shooting the ball great. So that was the foundation of something to really work with. The question is, how much of that is going to be back and what it's going to look like.
Yeah. Guys, we talked briefly about Jerami Grant re-signing, but to me, that's going to go, I mean, for reasons that are solid, going to go well under the radar of Paul George deciding to return. But I like that, guys. I mean, he has done some big things, really made some big steps since he's come to the Thunder. I'm interested to see where he goes. I mean, I don't know that he becomes, I don't know what he becomes, Eric, but he's an intriguing talent, great athleticism. We're not going to probably talk about it nearly as much as Paul George, obviously, but I think that's a good, solid piece to have in your back pocket.
Yeah, it is. And whether or not they keep Jerami Grant for the next 3 years, it's good to have that asset. Mm-hmm. With the salary cap going up next year and probably the year after that, it's not going to be a massive jump. But when it does go up, Jerami Grant's a valuable player because that's a reasonable deal that he's on. I guess 3 years, $27 million. And he's young and he still has upside. So I think that Jerami Grant is a player that's still growing. He was a guy that the Thunder needed to bring back, whether they brought back Carmelo Anthony or not, because frankly, Jerami Grant needs to play the bulk of the minutes at power forward because he's a better defender than Carmelo Anthony, and he has a high free throw rate too. He gets to the line more, and he's a guy who's a good finisher around the rim. So, and he's improved finishing around the rim. So he was a guy they had to have back, and it's on a deal that's reasonable enough to where you can justify paying the tax on a guy like him. The question is, do they want to pay the tax on a guy like Kyle Singler? Do they want to pay the tax on a guy like Carmelo Anthony? Mm-hmm. Those are the real questions that the Thunder has to face probably in the next month or so. All
right, lots of questions there. I mentioned Nerlens Noel when we started. I think Brett has got some sort of insight on the Kentucky line here. We just keep adding Kentucky players here in Oklahoma City, Brett.
All these guys I covered in college.
Yeah, well, nothing wrong with that. What's your take on what he could potentially mean? He's had a very up and down, obviously, start to his career in the NBA. Lots of question marks about Noel.
Yeah, he was in the 2013 draft, which we know Sam Presti kind of loves. Probably would have been the #1 pick in that draft if he hadn't torn his ACL in February of that freshman year at Kentucky. Did that at Florida, by the way. Billy Donovan and I were both in the building that night when that happened. He's a guy he came in with a lot of upside. He has a tremendous shot blocking ability. He's got a real knack for it, a real timing for it. He was an okay offensive player his first couple years in Philly, putting up numbers on a bad team, really only like 10 points a game. He's not a scorer, but he is a high-level defender. He's a good passer. He's a really good shot blocker. He just comes with some baggage. You know, he had trouble getting on the floor consistently in Dallas. He got a 5-game suspension for a violation of the league's anti-drug policy. That was a third positive marijuana test, is what nets you 5 games. But look, by the end of the year, he came back. He played the last 12 games before that suspension after a thumb injury. He was pretty good, high-level rebounding, good shot blocking in that stretch. And Rick Carlisle, the Mavericks coach, who is not a guy to mince words, said that by the end of the year, he really felt like Nerlens had proven to him that he could fit in and play in a winning system in the NBA. He got into a numbers game there that wasn't going to bring him back. He turned down a lot of money from Dallas last year, and he's going to play here on the minimum on kind of a prove-it deal. I think the hope for the Thunder is he is looking at Oklahoma City and saying, that is where I can go and rehab myself in the way that a guy like Dion Waiters did. Different kinds of issues, but same kind of principle.
Where could he fit in, Eric, in your mind? I mean, obviously, we don't quite know where he is right now. I mean, he, like Brett said, limited time last season, but how potentially could he fit into what the Thunder has right now?
Well, the Thunder loves to switch, and Nerlens is a guy who can guard multiple positions. He's athletic enough to where he can do that, and then he's definitely a guy who can definitely elevate, be a good pick screen setter and roll to the rim, a la Steven Adams. And frankly, the Thunder just needed a good backup center. They played Jerami Grant a lot of minutes there, but Jerami Grant kind of had mixed results in terms of the net rating when it came to him being on the floor. I think the Thunder was giving up 108 points per 100 possessions with Jerami Grant playing that 5 spot. That's not very good. Jerami Grant's capable of doing it, but Nerlens Noel gives them another look. He gives them another look on a cheap contract. And, it gives you some cover for Steven Adams, so you're not having to wear him out and play him a ton of minutes. Hopefully Nerlens can spell him a little bit, and the Thunder's drop-off defensively at the 5 isn't as big as it was when Steven Adams was off the floor last year.
He's an intriguing ad. I'm curious to see what he looks like come start of practice and preseason, guys. Before we get out of here, a lot of free agency talk, obviously, but it's also time to start the summer league. Brett, you're actually games. I know, some basketball games to actually watch and see what's going on. Thunder earlier today, Thursday, announced their roster, which people had been clamoring for. They can quit asking you two to tell them when the roster's coming out for summer league.
I hope it was all they dreamed of.
There's a lot of names on there I frankly had not seen in a long time.
Where's Hamidou Diallo?
Yeah,
I demand justice.
Free Hami.
By the way, just to clarify, it's not that he's not going to be on the roster, but he's not right now because
he's not here yet. He's physically here. I think he flew to Las Vegas with the Thunder. The tricky part is he's not a Thunder yet. There's still a trade that has to go through. That trade can't go through until Friday because he's part of a trade that involved an active player. Dwight Howard is going from Charlotte to Brooklyn. Hamidou Diallo comes over here as the 45th pick in the second round of the draft as part of that trade. So that trade can get finalized as early as Friday. Won't necessarily be done Friday. When it does, he'll be in Vegas. We'll see if he gets to play. I don't know yet what the word is on that.
So the Thunder leaving him off the roster is not some sort of problem. It's not some sort of sign of disaster. They can't actually acknowledge him as a member of the Thunder.
He does not exist until the Dwight Howard deal is done.
That's right.
He does not exist.
He's in limbo.
Hamidou Diallo is just floating in the ether. He's an idea more so than an actual guy who can jump really high.
Hamidou Diallo.
Hamidou Diallo. Jeez.
Well, guys, I want to talk a little bit about probably the biggest name on the roster, Terrence Ferguson, in a second. But Eric, like I said, there are some names on that roster that are going to be unfamiliar to Thunder fans. You may not have thought about them for a while, guys that maybe had played college ball a while ago, picked up, not exactly a litany of really known names. But what are you wanting to see out of this team while they're in Vegas?
I just want to see the guys, get out of their comfort zone. I think Terrence Ferguson's a guy who said that, he doesn't want to just be a corner 3 specialist, and he shouldn't be because he's too athletic, he's too young, and he has too much potential for the Thunder or any team to pigeonhole a guy like that into one particular role. He needs to do some different things in Summer League. They need to be okay with him going out there and screwing up and making mistakes. That's what Summer League's for. You go out there and you experiment and you get guys experience on the ball. You know, you get guys experience doing some things that they normally wouldn't do. And Terrence Ferguson has a chance to be, you know, a young building block for this Thunder team that frankly just hasn't had much success or hasn't had a bunch of young building blocks in the past 5 years, whether it's, you know, trading draft picks to other teams to strengthen the team they already have, or just picking bad players like Mitch McGary or Cameron Payne. Well, all right, I'll give Mitch McGary a pass because he was hurt a bunch and marijuana. But you know, the point is, with Terrence Ferguson, the Thunder has a real opportunity to build what the league covets, one of the most valuable things in the league, that two-way wing with great athleticism, can hit a three, can defend multiple positions. And this is a really exciting time to see Terrence Ferguson, I guess, almost in a leadership role with this team, and not to mention just Terrence Ferguson, but some of these other guys too, like Devin Hall from Virginia, a guy who comes in with a lot of experience, playing some high caliber basketball in the ACC, and starting for a really good program that's put out, you know, a few NBA players in the past few years. And Virginia has a track record now of putting out NBA guards. I would expect Devin Hall to be a guy that can be ready to play for the Thunder if necessary. It's not an ideal situation, but it's one where I wouldn't be surprised if that was a guy that made the Thunder roster.
You know, looking at that roster, one thing stood out to me about Terrence Ferguson. He's still the youngest guy on the roster. He's 20, guys.
It's a baby.
He was born in '98. I remember stuff in '98, pretty clearly in '98. Brett, you had a chance to talk to Terrence Ferguson before the team left, Summer League team left. And what Eric said about, you know, what he could become, it sounds like he's aware of the possibility that exists for him.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, he started work. He said he took about a week and a half off at the start of the summer. He's had a big summer, you know, just in terms of getting in, working out by himself, and then getting back up here to Oklahoma City. Worked out in Dallas at SMU, just kind of in the gym alone. Had a little bit of a program from the Thunder to work with. And then he's been back here this summer working with coaches, trying to just soak up everything he can. You know, one of the things I didn't get in the story that he talked about is when he played USA basketball for Sean Miller way back when, I think he was 16 years old. That's the coach he ultimately committed to play for at Arizona and didn't play. He said that was the first time he really started to get inquisitive about basketball. He started to ask a lot of questions. Why am I here in this specific spot on the floor? What could I do? How could I do this differently? And so all that stuff is kind of carried over. He watches his own workouts, so whether he's in the gym with a group for training camp or whether he's in the gym by himself, all those workouts are recorded. He goes back and watches those, sometimes with an assistant coach, sometimes by himself, and just kind of looks, did I make this cut hard enough? Am I going fast enough here? So he's a guy, look, the Thunder can get better at a lot of places. Russell Westbrook could get better in some areas. Paul George can still get better. Those guys aren't past the point of getting better. But if there's a guy that's going to make a big leap for them, this is one of the really strong candidates.
Is Terrence Ferguson, guys, a player in your mind that could see his minutes increase, I mean, double potentially next season? Does he have that kind of, I mean, is there a spot for him, Brett, to potentially have that kind of, you know, mark on next season?
Yeah, I mean, he averaged 12 minutes a game, I think. So 24 that's half a game. He could get into that range, I think. If you look at some of the guys he's been competing with, he competed with last year for minutes. Josh Eustace may or may not be around here. I think those are Ferguson's minutes now. And we don't know, as we talked about earlier, we don't know what Andre Robertson is going to be at the start of the season. So, and we don't know what's happening at this stage. As we record this, we don't know what's happening with Corey Brewer. So, you know, Ferguson could be a guy who is the lead guy, who's either starting in that spot when if Andre Robertson isn't ready to play, and is his lead back up there when he is.
All right. Guys, lots more going on in the offseason. We'll get to all of it as we continue to do Thunder Thursdays throughout the offseason, but that's it for today. So be sure to stay with the best coverage team anywhere at newsok.com and every day in the Oklahoman.